Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. This week we're going to talk about collecting qualitative data, and this has some very distinct variations in the methodology of what we've learned about when we're collecting quantitative data. Some of the characteristics for qualitative data include the fact that it's usually expressed in words. The information in the data is collected to build a story or understanding of a concept or variable from the perspective of the participants. The qualitative data is bulkier than quantitative data because you're talking about words, and you may be interested in one single word that you're looking at throughout the data you collected, or a sentence, or it could be an entire page that can represent the data. Qualitative data is collected during many different steps in the research process, as opposed to quantitative data where those steps are clearly defined prior to the data collection beginning. The explicit procedures for collecting the data may not really be known before the data collection begins. Again, this is very different from a quantitative perspective. And the systematic nature of data collection is what we talk about when we talk about how we're going to record and monitor the data collection. So it's not strict and rigorous like it is in quantitative. And then we may have changes along the way in data collection, but these are going to be informed by the data we've already collected. So this is very much an ongoing developing process from the qualitative standpoint, where you have an idea from the beginning of what you're going to do, but then as you move through it, things may change. There are four main types of data collection that we're going to explore. Narrative interviewing, which is the most common. There's participant observation. There's secondary content data, and there's historical data. So this is what we're going to talk about today in terms of the qualitative data collection methods. I always like to caution students regarding qualitative data, and my caution is while it appears that it's simpler because of the less structure, the less rigor, the less upfront work that you do, that it's easier than quantitative research. However, I'm going to say qualitative research is harder. It requires a high level of skills in conducting this type of research, especially from the interview process. You have to have strong interview skills to direct these open-ended interviews without getting lost, without going down all these rabbit trails, and without confining your participant to just talk about certain things. It takes a lot of practice to be able to do this. I personally love qualitative research. I just imagine myself as being this amazing qualitative researcher because I love the writing, I love the in-depth, I love the context, I love all of it. I think it is so important, and I've come to admit to myself I will never be a qualitative research. It requires focus, it requires patience, it is tedious, it requires so much time, so much more time than quantitative research does. So while I love it, love reading it, really wish that I could someday be a qualitative research, but I think I've admitted to myself it's not one of my strongest areas. I hope personally you love it. I hope you develop the skills for it, and I hope you carry it out, because I think it is vitally important to the clients that we serve that we're able to tell their stories from a research perspective and not just break down their situations down to numbers. It's so hard to break the human condition down to numbers. We lose so much when we do that. So I personally hope this is a strong area for you and you love it and you continue to develop it and you carry it out in your practice. We're going to begin with narrative interviewing, and this is where participants tell the stories in their own words. And again, this is one of the most difficult data collection methods in the qualitative process. You have to have very strong interviewing skills to be able to pull this off. When we choose narrative interviewing, we're choosing it because we have a purpose where we want the participants to tell their own stories in their own ways, using their own words. As qualitative interviews, we're not going to be bound by strict rules and procedures. Again, we need those strong interviewing skills so that we don't lose control of the interview, but on the other side, we don't want total control of the interview because we want the participant to be free to tell their story. so we can get meaningful information. So we're going to make every effort to engage research participants in meaningful discussions and not necessarily just a question-answer interview. During the interview process, they may deviate from that original research problem depending on what the participants choose to tell us. But if we deviate from that original research problem, we also have to be able to bring back that information and tie it to what we were looking at somehow, because things are going to be connected. The stories are going to be connected. Again, this is those really need those strong interviewing skills here. And the narrative interview it's the basic component of case research for case studies, and it's used in feminist research and then participatory action research, which brings in narrative interviewing along with participant observation. When we do narrative interviewing, we need to be very clear about our starting point and the procedures that we're going to use for checks and balances and the decisions we make along the way. Because we don't have a strong, structured, laid out point A to point B to point C, we're going to have some procedures set in our mind and written down so that we can have some checks and balances as we're doing this interview process. Again, so we get meaningful information, we don't constrain our participant, yet we don't go off all over the place getting information that's not going to inform what we're looking and trying to inform. And because the qualitative approach and in the narrative interviewing is so subjective, again, we're looking for that participant's experience, we may want to limit how much of the published research we read about the topic area prior to beginning our interview processes. We don't want to taint or introduce bias on our part where we're going to consciously or unconsciously guide a participant to provide information that's going to fit with what's already published out there. So unlike quantitative research, where we're going to complete a very thorough literature review or review of everything that's known about the topic area, we're not going to necessarily do that in qualitative research. We're actually going to read the published literature as we gather information through our interview process. So you may complete one or two of your interviews, see what those participants are telling you, and then go back to the literature and read a little bit more about that. And then it guides your future interviews based on what your participants have told you and then based on what you've read in the literature. Because narrative interviewing involves so much time with participants and individuals, you're going to have to decide ahead of time how to approach the potential research participants before data collection occurs. So you're going to need to have an understanding of the population you're working with, how to approach them, and then be able to set up time they'll feel comfortable engaging with you for an extended period. And you're going to decide this before your data collection occurs, because you're going to have a plan for this part. Unlike quantitative research, where your data collection tools are set ahead of time before you ever begin your data collection and they don't change, in qualitative research, after you start those first few interviews, depending on what you learn, you may change the questions you ask in future interviews or how they're conducted. In quantitative, we learn that if you change the way you collect the data from beginning to end, then this is a threat to internal validity. Now, in qualitative, we don't have concerns about internal validity and external validity. We change as we go. We adapt to what we're learning, and we may change the questions that we ask again, or the way that we do it based on those original interviews. We also have to decide ahead of time as how the interview is going to be structured, where it's going to take place at, what questions you're going to initially begin with, how long it's going to take. You're going to decide whether you're going to audio record it, video record it. All of those things do have to be decided ahead of time. And then again, it can actually be altered as you move forward once you've interviewed a few of your participants. So the ways that we do record narrative data, again, the most common and reliable way is through audio taping, recording it as it's happening. Sometimes there's videotaping that's also possible, but either way, every word of the interview must be transcribed. So if you're recording it, you're either going to have to pay somebody to transcribe that, or you're going to have to do that yourself. And again, very time consuming, and it's very important that it's transcribed exactly as the participant said it. There are some programs now that are much better and intuitive, and will actually take the audio and put it into text, but then somebody still has to make sure that it's accurate and that it's corrected along the way. In quantitative research, we talked about validity and reliability in terms of internal validity of the methodology, and then threats to internal validity. In qualitative research, again, we don't talk about validity and reliability because, as you see, we don't have those objective, very strict, rigorous procedures in place. We talk about trustworthy and truth value. So we must have some way to assess the credibility of the data that we're collecting. And one way is what's called triangulation, and this involves comparing data from multiple perspectives. So we may have an interview process, and based on that, we may look at client records, we may look at other data that could be available to verify what the individuals are telling us. And we also do member checking. And so sometimes that involves where we go back to our participants and we say, after we've transcribed and after we've begun to analyze the information, we can go back to them and we say, this is the meaning that I took from what you told me. Am I accurate in understanding that? So we have, through triangulation or member checking, we use to establish the trustworthiness and the truth value of the narrative data that we've collected. Advantages and disadvantages of narrative interviewing. Again, the advantage is that richness of data generated. You get to really sit and listen to an individual's story and the meaning that they apply to their lives and the experiences they've had with whatever concept or variable you're interested in exploring. The disadvantage, again, it's time consuming. And because it's so time consuming, there's a probability that you will tire. And when we get tired, we're going to tend to take shortcuts. And when we take shortcuts, we're going to end up imposing our own biases and perspectives on what the research participants are saying. So the disadvantage of it is, again, that time consuming, tedious process of going through the mountains of information that you receive. The next data collection method up is that of participant observation. And this is where we actually take part in whatever we're observing. So we're going to take part in it and be active and experience it and then study it at the same time. So again, like I explained, this really does require some high-level skills because you're actually going to have to be able to experience it for yourself and then at the same time step back and observe it as if you're not experiencing it. Within participant observation, we're going to establish and maintain ongoing relationships with the research participants that we have in the field setting. So we're actually going to develop these relationships. Rapport is important. And as you can see, as a researcher, your bias, the subjectivity of who you are is going to become involved in this. We actually engage in the events and the activities as they happen, the ones that we're observing. And so we have a participant role, observer role, and we have to balance that. And it's not easy to do. So first of all, we do have to keep a balance between participant and observer. And again, our experiences as being a part of the activities, and then separate that back and be the observer of the others who are experiencing those activities. And because we're actually asking to become a part of the group, to experience whatever those the participants are experiencing, we want to be a participant ourselves. We're going to have some understanding of the culture of the group that we're trying to become a part of, so that we know how to access it, so that we know who to talk to gain access and to gain permission to do that. And within this, in establishing those relationships, that more meaningful the relationship we can establish, the more meaningful data we will collect. Again, you're really becoming a part of the research when you do this, and there will be bias in here, but you learn to recognize the bias and you learn to separate yourself out for that observer role so that you can say, okay, this is my bias, this is my experience, this is what happened, this is what I see from this other perspective, and this is what I hear from the other perspective. Because participant observation will include perhaps some narrative interviewing also, so you get the in-depth meaning of the others who are experiencing it based on what you're experiencing. The data that you generate from participant observation includes what you're observing. You record what you observe. It's going to include interviews, again, those in-depth interviews. You may use existing documents and artifacts, and you're going to reflect on your own personal experiences. So you actually have 4 potential different data sources that you're going to be collecting and then synthesizing and integrating together to get this very in-depth, rich, contextual story of what happened during whatever the event is that you were actually becoming a part of and observing. And again, to test the trustworthiness and the truth value, you're going to use triangulation. You're going to look at those 4 different data sources that you had, and you're going to look and see how they mirror each other and what those common areas are. And so that's going to give you some reasonable confidence when there's agreement about the subject under study from those 4 different data sources. And again, that flexibility of that participant observation, we can take those opportunities and check out our personal assumptions and ideas through the member checking, through looking at other aspects that are happening at that time. Is this congruent with what I'm experiencing? Maybe a question that we ask ourselves. Advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages of participant observation, of course, is we can collect from multiple sources of data, and that gives us the ability to do a little bit more of credibility checking of the data. Again, disadvantages, time considerations. You do risk becoming too immersed as a participant or too distant as an observer. You have to really be able to balance those two. Either one of those will compromise the data that you've collected and the meaning that you're going to be able to flesh out of that. The third data collection method for qualitative research is that of secondary content. And this is a form of existing text data that we can look at to conduct qualitative research. Now, secondary content is text data. It's words, it's stories that were recorded at some other time and for some other purpose than the research question that we've posed. So it's very similar to secondary data in a quantitative perspective, but the way we collect it and the meaning we make from it is different. The content data that we're collecting, the secondary data, it could actually be firsthand or secondhand data. So an example of firsthand would be if we're looking at diaries of individuals, the individual who actually wrote the diary, versus if we're looking at records of a social worker who is reporting clients' behavior or clients' experiences, and it's their interpretation of those experiences. Content data, it's usually counted and categorized according to meaningful themes. Again, very tedious, very rich, lots of context, lots of time, lots of work. There are some software programs now where you can put in some of this text data and it will do some of that analysis in terms of looking for the same concepts, the same sentence structures, the same themes, and help you with that. But it still requires so much time on the part of the researcher to flesh out those categories and the counting of those themes that you're looking for. The data collection procedure here is you're restricted to what's available. It may be available from multiple sources, but you're still restricted to what's going to be available to you in terms of the data, that secondary data. So first you're going to have to determine if there's a sufficient amount of data that exists to answer your research question. Are you going to be able to access enough data that's going to be able to provide you the meaning you need to answer that research question. And because we're reading and reviewing stories, text data for a purpose not originally intended, we have to keep in mind what the original intent was of those writings to get full understanding and meaning from them. So we actually have to know what the intent was when those documents, whatever we're looking at, was written, because that's going to help inform the meanings that we pull from them. And we're going to have to establish coding procedures that are going to ensure participant confidentiality, because oftentimes when we're looking at secondary data, there's going to be some personal identifying information in there. So when we start pulling the information out that we're looking for, we have to make sure we're going to code things so that we can protect those who wrote the data. Even though you're collecting words, secondary data, information from existing forms, it's going to have to be put into a transcript form, just like your narrative interviewing is. Everything's going to have to be put into a transcript form so that you can then analyze everything in the same way to pull out the meanings. When we talk about trustworthiness and truth value, of course, first-hand data is going to be more credible than second-hand data. First-hand data is the actual experience of the person who was writing it. Second-hand data is going to be an interpretation by the person writing the information. We can possibly use some triangulation in this. We may or may not have access to those who wrote the data. If we do, we can do some member checking. But in this, it's going to be a little bit harder to establish the trustworthiness and the truth value of the information. Advantages and disadvantages. Of course, the advantage is the data already exists, and so this saves time and money. You don't have to collect the data. The disadvantage is because it already exists, it's going to be limited in scope. It was there for a reason other than what you're looking at. So you're trying to make something that exists fit with what you're looking at. So there's going to be a limited scope to it. The final data collection method we're going to be looking at is that of historical data. And this is data that is collected in an effort to study the past. And then in historical data, it can be obtrusive or it can be unobtrusive. And meaning the unobtrusive, again, is we can be looking at documents that already exist. We can actually be obtrusive and we can interview individuals about a historical event that they have experienced. If we're interviewing them about a historical event that they have experienced, this again is going to be first-hand data, which has more credibility. Second-hand data, we actually may be interviewing, so let's say we're going to interview a World War II veteran about what they experienced during the war, versus we're going to interview a daughter about what their grandfather or what their father experienced during the war. So we determine what's firsthand and what's secondhand, and whether we're going to be obtrusive or unobtrusive. And it's going to be based on what we have access to. In historical data, I guess we actually consider that we're retrieving the data as opposed to collecting it, because we're looking for historical context here. So we're going to retrieve information about an event that's happened in the past, about a variable that's happened in the past, versus collecting information about something that's current or could potentially happen in the future. And because we're retrieving information, we have to consider that what we're investigating, we have to make sure it existed in the past, because many things that we investigate now did not exist in the past. Just look at technology. We couldn't look at social media back in the 1800s. It didn't exist. So we have to make sure that what we're investigating actually existed in the past, because we're retrieving information, not necessarily collecting information. And then we have to make sure that the data is relevant to our research question, and that the types of data that are available to answer our research question are going to be able to inform it. Again, it's going to be limited in scope because of the fact that we're looking at things that have already taken place. And again, once we've identified this and the data that we have access to, we're going to have to determine, does enough data exist? Is it easily accessible? Are we actually going to be able to carry this out? So this goes back to the feasibility of your research question. Are you going to be able to access data that's going to be able to answer your research question? Very similar to others in establishing the trustworthiness and the truth value, you can use some triangulation if possible. with historical data, looking at multiple data sources. The more corroboration we have among the data, then of course the stronger our resulting conclusions will be. And our conclusions can only be as good as the data that we base them on. So we have some very limited trustworthiness and truth value in historical data because, again, we're looking at things in the past from a current perspective and trying to make sense of those. Advantages and disadvantages. Advantage, the data already exists, and this does save time and money. Disadvantage, it's not always easily available or accessible. Disadvantage, the risk of researcher bias when analyzing the letters or the documents, whatever you're looking at. And the disadvantage is we cannot reconstruct the past and impose present day views, standards, and ideas, which goes back to our researcher bias. So we have to truly become an objective observer of these historical documents, and that's a little bit difficult to do at times. And just as with whether it's interviewing, whether it's participant observation, whether you're looking at secondary data or historical data, this is very, again, time-consuming reading information over and over and over again. And it takes a very special person to do this type of research. So there's you a snapshot of qualitative data collection from the four main perspectives in terms of interviewing, participant observation, secondary data, and historical data. As you read more and more of the published literature in terms of qualitative research, I hope you have a greater appreciation for the work that has gone into this and the methods that they have used to make sure there's trustworthiness and truth value in it. Publishing qualitative data is a little bit more difficult because so many people do not recognize it as having scientific merit. But there are some journals out there that's all they do is publish qualitative data. And you will find those in the feminist research literature, anthropology, some sociology. So you have to look a little harder for the qualitative studies, but they're out there. And they generally are looking at new areas of interest. Anything that we study from a quantitative standpoint has started from a qualitative standpoint. So while some individuals don't give a lot of credence to the qualitative, it is what births the higher levels of knowledge and the higher levels of research. So hope you enjoy this. Hope you enjoy this form of research. And I truly do hope that you carry it out in your practice because I think it has so much meaning to it.